It was a quiet evening in the city, one of those calm moments just before night fully settles in. The lights from the tall buildings outside reflected softly through the glass doors of the Grand Haven Hotel, painting faint golden streaks on the marble floor. The lobby had that peaceful kind of hum, people coming and going, soft footsteps echoing, the distant sound of rolling suitcases, and the murmur of polite conversations near the front desk. In the corner of the lobby stood a glossy black grand piano. It had been there for years, mostly for decoration, though sometimes a hired musician would play gentle tunes in the evening. But tonight the piano sat untouched, its lid closed, waiting. Most people walked past it without even noticing. They were busy checking in, answering phone calls, or taking selfies under the chandelier. Among the crowd was a young man who didn't quite blend in with the rest. He wasn't wearing a suit like the businessmen by the bar, nor was he dressed like a tourist. He carried only a small backpack and looked a bit tired, as if he'd been traveling all day. His shoes were worn, his jacket a little wrinkled. He wasn't anyone famous or important, at least not to anyone there. But his eyes, soft and thoughtful, seemed to hold something deeper, something that didn't match his quiet appearance. He walked slowly through the lobby, looking around as if searching for something. Then his gaze stopped at the piano. For a moment he just stood there, watching the instrument as though deciding whether to approach. He hesitated, perhaps not sure if guests were even allowed to play it. Then he looked at the front desk. No one seemed to be paying attention. So almost shyly he walked over, placed his backpack down beside the piano bench and gently lifted the lid. The light from the chandelier reflected off the piano's black surface. He ran his fingers across the keys, not playing yet, just feeling them. Then he sat down. His back straightened, his hands hovered above the keys, and for a few seconds the world around him seemed to pause. When the first note sounded, it was soft, almost hesitant. But it carried. The gentle tone cut through the low noise of the lobby, clear and clean. Heads turned, just slightly curious. Then came the second note and the third, flowing together into a melody that grew stronger with every measure. People began to notice. The sound was unlike the usual background music they were used to. It wasn't the kind of playing you'd hear from someone just fooling around. There was emotion in it, a quiet sadness at first, then a warmth that filled the room. The music had a way of touching something in people, something that words often couldn't reach. At the reception desk, one of the clerks lifted her head and smiled. A few guests turned their chairs toward the piano. The young man didn't seem to notice any of them. His eyes were half closed, his face calm, completely lost in what he was playing. His fingers moved smoothly, gracefully, like water flowing down a stream. A few children who had been running around near the elevators stopped to listen. A couple near the fireplace leaned closer together, whispering something about how beautiful it sounded. Even the bellhop who had been rushing to help a guest with luggage slowed down his steps, trying to catch a glimpse of the mysterious player. The melody built up, soft at first, then more powerful, more alive. The man's entire being seemed to pour into every note. You could hear the ups and downs of emotion in the way he played, the longing, the peace, the joy, and the quiet ache of something unspoken. It was as if the piano itself had been waiting for someone like him to wake it up. Outside the hotel, the night grew darker. Cars passed by, their lights flashing across the windows, but inside, the only thing that mattered was the music. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Some stood with their phones out recording. Others simply watched, moved by what they were hearing. A woman near the bar whispered, "He must be a professional." Another replied softly, "I don't think so. Look at his clothes." And yet neither could look away. The young man seemed unaware of all of it. He wasn't performing. He was expressing. It wasn't for attention or applause. It was like he needed to play, as though the piano was the only way to speak his heart at that moment. After a few minutes, he transitioned into another tune, slower, gentler. The kind of melody that makes you think of home, of people you miss, or moments you wish you could relive. His hands moved delicately, each note placed with care as if every sound carried a memory. Some in the audience blinked back tears, surprised at how deeply a stranger's music could touch them. Behind the crowd, sitting quietly in one of the plush armchairs near the corner, was an older man reading a newspaper. He had been there when the young pianist first sat down but hadn't looked up at first. Now, though, his paper rested on his lap. His expression changed as he listened, first curiosity, then recognition. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The tune being played was familiar. He knew it well. It was a piece he himself had composed years ago, something deeply personal, something he hadn't heard played like this in a long time. The older man stayed silent, not wanting to interrupt. He studied the pianist carefully, the way he touched the keys, the feeling he brought into the piece. It wasn't just technical skill. It was emotion soul, the kind of playing that only someone who truly understood the music could deliver. The crowd continued to grow. The front desk staff whispered among themselves. Even the manager, who had been in his office, came out to see what was happening. But the music didn't stop. The young man seemed carried away by it, his movements fluid and confident, his heart guiding his hands more than any sheet of music could. Every person in the lobby could feel it, that rare kind of connection between artist and audience, where time slows down and all the usual worries fade away. No one checked their phones. No one spoke. Even the clinking of glasses at the bar had stopped. It was as if the entire room had agreed to share this one quiet moment of beauty. Then, something subtle changed in the air. The young man's expression softened. His tempo slowed, his hands trembling slightly, not from nerves but from the intensity of feeling. He pressed the last few notes gently, almost like a whisper. The final chord lingered in the air, fading slowly into silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. It was as though everyone was afraid that any sound might break the spell. Then slowly, applause began to spread, soft at first, then louder, filling the lobby. People smiled, clapped, some even cheered. The young man looked surprised, almost embarrassed. He hadn't expected an audience, let alone this kind of reaction. He gave a small nod of thanks, a shy smile, and started to rise from the bench. But just as he reached for his backpack, a voice came from behind him, a calm, steady voice that carried across the lobby. That was beautifully played. The young man turned around, startled. Standing a few feet away was the older man who had been sitting quietly near the corner. His gray hair and gentle face gave him an air of quiet dignity. There was something familiar about him, though the young man couldn't quite place it. "Thank you," the pianist said softly. "It's one of my favorite pieces." The older man smiled. "I can tell," he replied. "You didn't just play it, you felt it." The young man nodded, unsure what else to say. There was something kind in the stranger's eyes, but also something sharp, like he was seeing more than just a performance. Then the older man added, almost to himself, "You know, I wrote that piece a long time ago." The pianist froze. For a moment, he thought he must have misheard. But when he looked closer, he noticed the subtle signs, the face he had seen before in old concert videos, the posture, the quiet confidence. His heart skipped a beat. Before he could speak, someone in the crowd whispered the older man's name. The sound spread quickly. A few gasps rippled through the lobby. People turned their phones toward him, whispering excitedly. The young man's eyes widened as realization set in. It was him, the man whose music he had studied for years, the composer who had inspired him to start playing piano in the first place. The legend himself was standing right there, just a few steps away, smiling at him. But before anyone could react further, the older man raised a hand gently, as if asking for calm. "Don't stop," he said softly. "Play another." The young man hesitated, completely thrown off by the moment. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from disbelief. The composer of the song he had just played was standing before him, asking him to continue. The crowd waited, silent, eager. He sat down again slowly, took a deep breath, and placed his fingers on the keys. The older man stood close, watching quietly, his expression unreadable. The young man began to play. Not the same song as before, but another piece, one of his own this time. Something more personal, something that came from his heart. And once again the music filled the air, soft and powerful all at once. The older man's face softened and he nodded, as if understanding every note without a single word spoken. The night went on, but no one in that lobby forgot that moment. The night a young man played the piano alone and everyone stopped to listen, unaware of who was sitting nearby until the truth quietly revealed itself. The sound of the piano still lingered in the air long after the young man stopped playing. The guests in the hotel lobby seemed to hold on to that feeling, as if they didn't want it to end. Some were still recording on their phones. Others simply stood there smiling, caught between wonder and disbelief. The young pianist slowly lifted his hands from the keys and exhaled. He didn't know how long he had been playing. It felt like time had stopped the moment he sat down. When he finally looked around, he was surprised to see how many people had gathered. And then there was the older man, the one whose presence seemed to quiet the room even more. He stood a few feet away, calm and dignified, his eyes filled with warmth and curiosity. The young pianist could still feel his heart racing from what the man had said. "You know, I wrote that piece." The words echoed in his mind again and again. It couldn't be real. He had listened to that man's recordings since he was a boy. He had spent hours trying to imitate his style, to understand the emotion behind every note. And now, that same man was standing right in front of him as if out of a dream. The crowd started whispering, murmuring the name of the older man, and soon everyone in the lobby realized who he was. A few people gasped, some covered their mouths. The young pianist looked at him in awe, speechless. The older man smiled kindly and said, "What's your name, son?" "Ethan," the young man replied softly, though his voice shook a little. "Ethan," the man repeated, almost tasting the name. "You play beautifully. You understand the language of music, and that's rare. You didn't just copy the notes, you spoke through them." Ethan didn't know what to say. Compliments never meant much to him, but coming from this man, they felt like a gift. He managed a small smile. "Thank you, sir. Your music, it means a lot to me. It always has." The older man nodded slowly, as though he understood exactly what Ethan meant. He then gestured toward the piano. "Would you mind playing something else?" Ethan hesitated. His fingers still trembled slightly. He had played hundreds of times before, at home, in small gatherings, even for a few friends, but never with someone like this listening. And certainly not the composer of the very song he had just played. He glanced around the room. The crowd hadn't left. If anything, it had grown larger. Cameras were still pointed his way, though he tried not to think about them. The older man's gentle smile gave him courage. He sat back down, took a deep breath, and began again. This time, he played one of his own pieces, a soft, reflective melody he had written years ago but never shared with anyone. It started quietly, with a slow rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Then it grew, shifting into waves of emotion that rose and fell like the tide. The crowd listened, captivated. The melody told a story without words, of loneliness, of dreams, of a search for something that always seemed just out of reach. The young man's fingers moved effortlessly, each note carrying meaning. The older man closed his eyes as he listened. His head moved slightly with the rhythm, as if he were feeling every part of the song in his soul. When the last note faded away, the room was completely silent again. No one dared to break the moment. Finally, the older man spoke softly. "You wrote that?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir. It's something I play when I can't find the right words." The older man's smile deepened. "That's the best kind of music there is." Applause filled the room again, louder this time. But to Ethan, none of it mattered. What mattered was the look on the older man's face, a look of genuine appreciation and maybe even admiration. When the crowd finally began to disperse, the older man motioned for Ethan to join him by the side of the lobby, away from the noise. The two sat down near a tall window overlooking the city lights. "You play with heart," the man said. "That's not something you can teach." "Where did you learn?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "Mostly by listening. My mom used to play when I was little, and we had an old piano at home. I learned by ear first, then tried to teach myself some theory later. I never went to any real music school." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Self-taught?" "Yes, sir." He nodded approvingly. "That explains a lot. You play freely without the stiffness of rules. That's what gives your sound its honesty." Ethan smiled at that. "I always thought not having formal training was a disadvantage." "Not always," the man said with a chuckle. "Sometimes the best players are the ones who never learn to follow the rules too closely." They sat quietly for a moment. The sound of the city traffic hummed outside. The faint scent of coffee drifted from the lobby cafe. Then the older man said, "Do you play professionally?" Ethan shook his head. "No, sir. I wish I did. I work at a music store back home." I play when I can, but mostly it's just for myself. The man looked thoughtful, his eyes softening. And yet when you play, it feels like you've lived 100 lives. That's what true musicians do, they make people feel. That's rarer than fame or money. Ethan smiled shyly. That means more to me than you know. There was a short pause, and then the man said quietly, You remind me of myself when I was your age. Ethan looked up in surprise. Me, really? The man nodded. Yes, I started just like you, playing in hotel lobbies, train stations, anywhere I could find a piano. Back then, no one knew my name. I played for whoever happened to be listening. Not because I wanted attention, but because I couldn't stop. It was something inside me that had to come out. Ethan listened carefully, every word sinking in. He couldn't believe this man. Someone he had admired for years was sharing his personal memories like this. The man continued, his voice calm but filled with emotion. There were times when I thought I'd never make it. People told me to give up, to find a real job. But music was the only real thing I ever knew. I played every night, even when no one cared to listen. Then one day someone heard me, someone who believed in me. That's how it all began. Ethan's eyes widened. So you were discovered just like that? The man chuckled softly. Not exactly. It took years. But that one person saw something others didn't. Sometimes that's all it takes. One moment, one chance encounter that changes everything. Ethan nodded slowly, his mind racing. He couldn't help but wonder, was this moment one of those for him? The older man stood up and stretched. Do you have somewhere to be? Ethan shook his head. Not really. I was just passing through. I'm here for a few days before heading home. The man smiled. Good. Then maybe we can talk again tomorrow. I'd like to hear more of your music if you're willing. Ethan stared at him, not sure if he had heard correctly. You want to hear me play again? Yes, the man said simply. You have something rare, Ethan. Don't waste it. Come by tomorrow afternoon. I'll be here. Ethan nodded, still in disbelief. I will. Thank you, sir. Really. The man placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Call me Leonard. Ethan froze for a second, feeling the weight of that name. It was strange. After all these years of hearing it on record covers, now it was being spoken like an invitation. Leonard smiled and turned to leave. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but a few people still whispered excitedly, talking about what they had just witnessed. The lobby had returned to its calm atmosphere, but the energy in the air was different now. Warmer, more alive. Ethan packed his small bag, still dazed from what had happened. As he walked out of the hotel, he looked back once more at the piano in the corner. The keys gleamed faintly under the lights, and he couldn't help but smile. That night, he barely slept. He replayed the moment again and again in his mind. The surprise, the applause, and most of all, the conversation with Leonard. Every word felt unreal. He wondered if he had imagined it all. But deep down, he knew it had been real. He sat by the window of his small hotel room, looking out over the city. The streets were quiet now, the lights shimmering in puddles left by a light rain. He thought about how strange life could be. One minute, he was just another traveler passing through. And the next, he was sharing a conversation with one of the greatest pianists alive. He opened his notebook, the one where he wrote small pieces of music when inspiration struck. The pages were worn, filled with scribbled notes and half-finished melodies. He flipped to a blank page and began writing again. This time the music came easily, flowing straight from his heart. Each note seemed to capture what he had felt that evening. The nerves, the awe, the quiet happiness of being seen and understood. He wrote until the sky outside began to lighten with the first traces of dawn. Then he leaned back, exhausted but content, and whispered to himself, tomorrow. Because tomorrow he would play again, and maybe, just maybe, it would change everything. The next morning, sunlight poured softly through the hotel window, lighting up the small room where Ethan sat half awake. He had barely slept a few hours. His mind was still full of music, replaying the sounds from the night before like a dream that refused to end. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still see the lobby, the grand piano, the people watching, and Leonard's calm, kind face. He had promised to meet him again that afternoon, and the thought made his heart race. He wasn't nervous in the usual way. It was something different, like a mixture of excitement and disbelief. A part of him still couldn't believe that the man he had admired for years had asked to hear him play again. He got ready slowly, trying not to overthink. He had never cared much about appearance, but today he brushed his hair, ironed his shirt, and even polished his old shoes. He didn't want to look out of place, even though he knew Leonard didn't seem to care about such things. By noon, he was back at the hotel lobby. It was quieter than the night before. The staff recognized him and greeted him with smiles. One of them whispered, "He's waiting for you," and pointed toward a quiet corner where Leonard was sitting by the window, a cup of tea beside him and a small leather notebook open on the table. Ethan took a deep breath and walked over. Leonard looked up as soon as he heard the footsteps and smiled warmly. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." "I wouldn't miss it," Ethan said. "Good," Leonard replied. "Sit down." They talked for a while before touching the piano. Leonard asked him simple questions: where he was from, how long he had been playing, what kind of music he loved most. Ethan answered honestly. There was something about the older man that made it easy to talk. He didn't act superior. He spoke like a friend, like someone who truly cared. After a few minutes, Leonard closed his notebook and gestured toward the piano. "Shall we?" Ethan nodded. His palms were slightly sweaty as he walked to the instrument. It wasn't the same kind of nervousness he had felt performing for others before. It was something deeper, like the weight of knowing that someone he respected so much was about to listen again. He sat down, adjusted the bench, and looked back at Leonard, who had taken a seat just a few feet away. "Anything you'd like to hear?" he asked. Leonard smiled faintly. "Play what you feel. That's always the best place to start." So Ethan began. This time he didn't overthink. He let his hands find their way naturally. The notes rose and fell like breathing. The sound was calm and steady but full of feeling. Leonard listened closely, his fingers tapping lightly on his knee in rhythm. After a few minutes, Leonard stood and came closer, leaning on the piano gently. "Do you mind if I join you?" he asked. Ethan froze. "You want to play with me?" Leonard nodded. "If you don't mind." "Of course not," Ethan said quickly, moving slightly to the side. Leonard sat beside him, his movements graceful and familiar, like someone greeting an old friend. His hands hovered over the keys for a second before he began to play along. The harmony that followed felt almost magical. Their notes intertwined effortlessly, blending like two voices telling the same story in different tones. Ethan tried to follow Leonard's lead, but soon realized he didn't have to. They both instinctively knew where the other was going. It was pure connection. No words, no planning, just shared understanding. People in the lobby began to notice again. Hotel guests paused, drawn by the music. But this time the sound was even richer, fuller. It wasn't just one pianist anymore. It was two generations meeting through music. When the song ended, the room erupted in gentle applause. Leonard chuckled softly, brushing his fingers across the keys one last time before standing. "Still sounds good after all these years," he said jokingly. Ethan laughed quietly, still in awe. "You're incredible," he said. Leonard shook his head. "No, we're incredible. You played beautifully. You have a gift, Ethan, don't doubt it." Ethan smiled shyly. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't," Leonard replied with a grin. "Just keep playing." They moved to a table afterward, sharing tea while talking about music, life, and how passion could sometimes be both a blessing and a burden. Leonard spoke about the early years of his career, the loneliness of traveling, the exhaustion of endless performances, the pressure to always be perfect. "I loved it," he said softly. "But it also took a lot out of me. There were days when I'd play for thousands and still feel completely alone after walking off stage." Ethan listened intently. "Did it ever make you want to stop?" Leonard looked out the window for a moment before answering. "Yes, many times. But then I'd sit at a piano and all the noise would fade away. The music always brought me back. That's the thing about it, it gives you peace when nothing else can." Ethan nodded, understanding completely. "That's how I feel too." Leonard turned to him and said, "Then you're already halfway there." They both laughed. It felt easy, natural, the kind of connection that doesn't happen often. After a pause, Leonard said, "I'm working on something new. A piece I haven't finished yet. Would you like to hear it?" Ethan's eyes widened. "Of course." Leonard reached into his leather bag and pulled out a few folded sheets of handwritten music. The notes were written neatly, but parts of the page were marked with little corrections and scribbles. He spread them across the piano stand and began to play. The melody was simple at first, gentle, almost fragile, but then it grew into something grand, emotional, full of movement and light. Ethan sat beside him, completely mesmerized. It was the kind of music that felt alive, as if it were breathing right there in the room. When Leonard stopped, the sound seemed to hang in the air. Ethan exhaled softly. "That's beautiful," he said. Leonard smiled faintly. "It's unfinished. I've been stuck on it for months. Something's missing." "What do you think it needs?" Ethan asked. Leonard looked at him. Maybe a new voice. A different touch. "Would you help me finish it?" Ethan blinked. "Me?" "Yes, you," Leonard said firmly. "You understand emotion. That's what this piece needs. Fresh energy. I've been hearing the same thoughts in my head for too long. I want to see what it sounds like through your hands." Ethan felt speechless. I don't know if I could." "You're you," Leonard laughed. "And you're you. That's enough." They spent the next 2 hours sitting side by side at the piano, trying ideas. Leonard played certain sections, and Ethan added his own variations. Sometimes it worked perfectly, sometimes not. But Leonard never seemed frustrated. He only smiled, offering gentle advice and encouragement. "Try that again," he'd say. "But this time don't think. Just feel it." Ethan followed his lead. And slowly the music began to take shape. It wasn't long before the sun outside started to set, the light turning golden across the marble floor. The hotel staff dimmed the lights and quietly set up candles for the evening. The two men were still deep in their work, lost in rhythm and sound. Finally, Leonard leaned back, stretching his hands. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's what it was missing." Ethan looked at him, confused. "Really?" Leonard nodded. "That balance between structure and soul. You brought it back." Ethan smiled, still not quite believing it. "I didn't do much." "You did everything," Leonard said with a grin. "Music isn't about who writes the most notes, it's about who gives the song its heart." They both sat silently for a while, letting the final notes fade. Then Leonard stood and said, "You should come by my studio tomorrow. I want you to record this with me." Ethan's mouth fell open. "Record with you?" "Yes," Leonard said simply. "It's time the world hears something new, and I think you're meant to be part of it." Ethan didn't know what to say. He could only nod, his heart pounding. "I'll be there," he whispered. Leonard placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Good, and remember, no matter what happens, never stop playing. Even if no one's listening, keep playing. Music finds the people it's meant to reach." As Leonard walked away, Ethan sat there for a long time, staring at the piano. The room was nearly empty now. The faint glow of the candles flickered against the polished surface of the instrument. He touched one of the keys softly, producing a quiet note that barely echoed. For the first time in his life, he felt something deeper than just passion. It was purpose. He thought back to how the whole thing had started. A simple decision to sit down and play in an empty lobby. No plan, no audience, no goal. Just music. And now somehow that one moment had opened a door he never even knew existed. As he stood to leave, one of the hotel staff stopped him and said, "That was amazing. You and Mr. Whitmore sounded perfect together." Ethan smiled politely. "Thank you," he said, though the compliment barely sank in. His mind was already somewhere else, thinking about the studio, the song, and the chance to create something alongside the man who had inspired him since childhood. He walked out into the cool night air, the city lights shimmering around him. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely alive. Every step he took seemed to match a rhythm in his heart, a quiet beat that told him this was only the beginning. When he reached his small hotel room, he sat down at the desk, pulled out his notebook, and began to write again. The notes came quickly, flowing like a stream that had finally been set free. At the top of the page, he wrote a title, New Beginning. And that night, as the city outside buzzed and faded into silence, Ethan kept playing quietly, his fingers moving with calm certainty. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He would follow it wherever the music took him. The next morning came quietly. The sky was pale with the first signs of dawn, and the city below was just waking up. In his small hotel room, Ethan sat by the window with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He hadn't slept much again. His mind was full of notes, ideas, and emotions that wouldn't settle down. He kept replaying Leonard's words from the day before. "Come to my studio tomorrow." It sounded simple, but for Ethan it was everything. He had spent years dreaming of what it might feel like to be in a real studio, surrounded by microphones and music sheets, creating something that mattered. And now somehow that dream was about to come true. He looked at his reflection in the window. Tired eyes, but a spark of something new. Hope, determination, maybe even a little fear. He wasn't sure what the day would bring, but he knew it would change something in him forever. By mid-morning, Ethan arrived at the address Leonard had written on a small piece of paper. It was an old brick building tucked between cafes and small shops. Easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. There was no big sign, just a small brass plaque by the door that read, "Whitmore Music Studio." He took a deep breath before pushing the door open. Inside, the smell of wood and coffee filled the air. The walls were lined with framed photos, black and white shots of Leonard performing in grand concert halls, shaking hands with other musicians, and standing beside orchestras. But there were also newer photos, smiling faces of students, musicians, and collaborators who had clearly passed through these doors over the years. A soft melody played from a record player in the corner. The sound was warm, rich, and timeless. Right on time, came Leonard's familiar voice from the hallway. Ethan turned to see him walking toward him, wearing a simple sweater and slacks. He looked relaxed, more like a mentor than a celebrity. "Good morning," Leonard said, his voice calm and kind as always. "I was hoping you'd show up." "I wouldn't miss it," Ethan said with a smile. Leonard gestured toward the main room. "Come in, let me show you around." The studio was cozy but full of character. A grand piano stood in the center of the room, its surface covered with scattered sheets of music. There were shelves filled with old records, stacks of notebooks, and an assortment of instruments, violins, guitars, even a cello in the corner. "This place has been my second home for years," Leonard said. "I've written most of my work here. Sometimes I think the walls themselves remember the songs." Ethan smiled, running his hand gently over the piano's smooth edge. "It feels like it." Leonard motioned toward the seat. "Go ahead, warm up a bit." Ethan sat down and began to play a few soft chords. The sound that came out was deeper, clearer than anything he had ever heard before. The acoustics of the room seemed perfect, every note floated, rich and balanced. Leonard watched quietly for a moment before saying, "Good, you're relaxed today. That's how you should play, without thinking too much." Ethan smiled nervously. "I'll try." "Don't try," Leonard said gently. "Just feel." They began working on the unfinished piece from the day before. Leonard handed Ethan the same sheets of music, now marked with new pencil notes. "Let's start from the middle section," he said. "That's where I think your touch makes the biggest difference." Ethan nodded, and they started playing together again. At first he followed the written notes carefully, but soon his instincts took over. He added small changes, soft pauses, lighter touches, slight shifts in tempo. Leonard listened closely, sometimes nodding, sometimes closing his eyes as if to fully absorb the sound. When they stopped, Leonard smiled. "Perfect. That's it. That's what I couldn't find before." Ethan looked at him, surprised. "You really think so?" Leonard leaned back in his chair. "I don't think I know. Sometimes the missing piece isn't another note or chord. Sometimes it's a person." The words hit Ethan deeply. He wasn't sure how to respond. All he could do was smile and whisper, "Thank you." Leonard stood up and stretched. "Let's take a short break. I want you to have something to eat before we start recording." He led Ethan to a small kitchen area at the back of the studio. There was a table with fruit, pastries, and 2 mugs of hot tea already waiting. They sat across from each other as sunlight poured in through the window. "Tell me something," Leonard said. "What made you start playing in the first place?" Ethan thought for a moment. "My mom used to play when I was a kid. She wasn't a professional, but she loved music. She used to say that the piano could tell stories without needing words. When she passed away, I kept playing. It made me feel close to her." Leonard's expression softened. "That's a beautiful reason. The best musicians play for something or someone they love. That's where the honesty comes from." Ethan nodded quietly. "I never really thought I'd be good enough to do anything serious with it. I just played because I couldn't stop. It's the only time I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Leonard smiled. "That's what music is supposed to do. It puts you in the present moment. That's where life happens. After finishing their tea, they returned to the piano. Leonard set up a small recorder on the side table. "Let's capture what we've got," he said. They began again, this time more confidently. The sound filled the room, blending effortlessly between them. Leonard's deep, steady tones balanced Ethan's lighter, emotional playing. Together, the piece finally felt complete. When the final note faded, Leonard let out a long breath. "That's it," he said softly. "That's the one." Ethan sat back, smiling in disbelief. "It felt right." "It was," Leonard said. "You brought it to life." He stopped the recorder and played it back. As the music filled the studio, Ethan listened closely, his heart swelling with pride. He had never heard himself sound like that before. It didn't feel like two separate people playing. It felt like one story told through four hands. When the song ended, Leonard turned to him. "I want to release this," he said. "Not as my song, but as ours." Ethan froze. "Ours?" "Yes, you've earned it. Music belongs to the ones who give it meaning, not just to the one who writes it." Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I don't even know what to say." "Say yes," Leonard replied with a grin. Ethan laughed softly. Yes, they shook hands, though it felt like more than just a handshake. It felt like the beginning of something bigger. Over the next few days, Ethan kept returning to the studio. They refined the recording, adjusted small parts, and added tiny details until Leonard declared it finished. Each day brought new stories, laughter, and lessons. Leonard told him about the people he had met over his long career, the kind, the difficult, the inspiring. He spoke of what fame felt like, how it could lift you up and sometimes trap you at the same time. Ethan listened to every word, soaking in the wisdom that could only come from experience. "You know," Leonard said one evening, "when I was your age, I thought success was about being known. But after all these years, I've learned that the real success is being understood." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's true in life too," Leonard smiled. "Exactly." By the end of the week, their piece was ready. Leonard called his assistant and said, "I want this sent to the label tomorrow morning. Make sure Ethan's name is listed first." Ethan's eyes widened. "You don't have to do that." "I do," Leonard said simply. "You deserve it." It was late when they finally finished. The studio was quiet except for the faint hum of the recorder. Leonard looked tired but content. He sat down slowly on the piano bench and said, "You know, I didn't plan any of this. I was just sitting in that hotel lobby because I wanted to hear the sound of that piano again. And then you started playing." Ethan smiled. "I'm glad you were there." Leonard nodded. "So am I." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Outside, the city lights blinked through the studio windows. After a moment, Leonard said softly, "You've reminded me why I started doing this in the first place. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what music was supposed to feel like. You brought that back." Ethan looked down, his voice quiet. "You've done the same for me. I didn't think anyone would ever notice my music. You gave me a reason to believe again." Leonard smiled. "Then we're even." The two shared a quiet laugh. There was a deep sense of peace in the room, the kind that only comes when two people truly understand each other without needing many words. As Ethan gathered his things to leave, Leonard said, "Come back next week. I want to start something new. Maybe it'll be the start of a bigger project." Ethan grinned. "I'll be here." He walked home under the streetlights that night, the city feeling brighter somehow. Everything seemed to glow. The people, the sounds, even the distant hum of cars. He couldn't stop smiling. When he reached his room, he opened his notebook again. But this time he didn't write music. He wrote a few simple words instead. Sometimes, the right song finds you when you're not even looking for it. He closed the book, turned off the lamp, and lay down, the faint sound of their new song still echoing in his head. For the first time in years, he felt not just hopeful, but certain. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. The following week felt like a blur for Ethan. After years of quiet practice and self-doubt, everything was changing so fast that he barely had time to take it all in. The collaboration with Leonard had stirred something deep inside him, something he didn't even know he had been missing. He spent most of his days thinking about the studio, the music, and the quiet conversations that filled the spaces between their notes. Leonard wasn't just a mentor. He had become a friend, someone who saw potential in him when he hadn't seen it himself. That Monday, Ethan arrived at the studio earlier than usual. The city streets were still quiet, washed with the golden light of early morning. He carried a small notebook under his arm and a nervous kind of excitement in his chest. When he pushed open the door, he was surprised to find Leonard already there, sitting at the piano. He was playing softly, something slow and wistful, almost like a lullaby. "Good morning," Ethan said, smiling. Leonard turned, a bit startled, but smiled warmly. "You're early today." "I couldn't sleep," Ethan admitted. "Too many ideas in my head." "That's a good sign," Leonard chuckled. "Come sit. I want to show you something." He handed Ethan a few sheets of music, handwritten with neat markings in pencil. "This is something I started years ago," Leonard explained. "I never finished it. Maybe now we can." Ethan studied the notes for a moment. "It's beautiful," he said softly. Leonard smiled. "Then let's bring it to life." They began playing together again, taking turns leading and following. The melody was full of emotion, the kind that seemed to tell a story without needing any words. At times it was tender, at times powerful, like the feeling of remembering something you thought you'd lost. As they played, something magical seemed to happen. Their hands moved almost instinctively, one guiding the other, their timing perfectly in sync. The music grew and shifted, filling the entire room with warmth and light. When they finally stopped, the last note hanging in the air, neither of them spoke for a moment. Leonard broke the silence first. "That," he said quietly, "is what music is supposed to feel like." Ethan nodded, still catching his breath. "It's like it already existed," he said. "We just found it," Leonard smiled. "Exactly." He stood slowly, stretching his back. "You know," he said after a pause, "I've worked with hundreds of musicians. Some were talented, some were skilled, but only a few played with real feeling. You have that." Ethan didn't know what to say. Compliments like that didn't come often, and especially not from someone like Leonard. "Thank you," he said softly. Leonard smiled. "No need to thank me. Just promise me you'll never stop playing the way you do now, no matter how big things get, no matter who's watching." "I promise," Ethan said. They spent the rest of the day fine-tuning the piece. Between takes, Leonard shared more stories from his past, touring across Europe, the exhaustion of constant travel, the nights where he'd question if fame was worth it. At one point, he looked at Ethan and said, "Do you know what I miss most about those years? Not the applause, not the awards. It's the moments like this when it's just you, the piano, and the truth." Ethan nodded. "I get that. It's the same reason I started playing in the first place." By late afternoon, they had finished recording. Leonard leaned back, satisfied. "We did it," he said. Ethan smiled. "It sounds incredible," Leonard nodded. "Now the world gets to hear it." A few days later, Leonard's assistant released the recording online. It was credited to Whitmore and Miller, The Silent Waltz. The name was Leonard's idea, meant to symbolize how two people from different worlds could create something that spoke without words. The response was immediate. Within hours, the video began spreading across social media. People shared clips praising the emotion and harmony in the music. Comments poured in from listeners around the world who said it moved them to tears. Ethan couldn't believe it. He kept refreshing the page, watching the views climb higher and higher. By the next morning, it had over 1 million views. When he arrived at the studio that day, Leonard was sitting by the window, smiling quietly as he read messages on his phone. "Looks like people like what they hear," Leonard said with a grin. "Like, they love it," Ethan said. "It's everywhere." Leonard chuckled softly. "Well, good music finds its own way." They talked for a while about the comments, the interviews they were being invited to, and the sudden attention. But Leonard didn't seem overly excited. Instead, he looked peaceful, like someone who had already lived through all this before and was simply happy to see it happen again through someone else. After a pause, he said, "You know, I think it's time I step back from the spotlight for good. Let the next generation take over." Ethan frowned. "You can't mean that. You still have so much to give." Leonard smiled gently. "Maybe, but now I can give it in a different way. Through you." Ethan didn't know what to say. The thought of not working with Leonard felt strange, almost wrong. Leonard seemed to sense that. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll still be around. But I want you to start writing your own music now. You've learned everything I can teach you." Ethan hesitated. "What if I'm not ready?" Leonard looked at him kindly. "You're more than ready." That night, after leaving the studio, Ethan walked through the city with his headphones on, listening to the silent waltz again and again. Each note reminded him of their journey, the hotel lobby, the lessons, the laughter, the long hours in the studio. He realized something important then. This wasn't just Leonard's story or his own. It was both of theirs, intertwined by music that neither of them could have created alone. The following weeks were full of new beginnings. Invitations came in for interviews, music festivals, and collaborations. But through it all, Ethan stayed grounded. Every time someone asked about his success, he told them the truth, that it all started with a moment of chance and a piano in a hotel lobby. One morning, as he was leaving his apartment, Ethan received a call from Leonard's assistant. "He wants to see you," she said softly. "He's not feeling too well today, but he asked for you." Ethan rushed to the studio immediately. When he arrived, Leonard was sitting by the window wrapped in a warm sweater, looking a little tired but smiling as always. "Hey," Leonard said quietly. "Glad you came." "Of course," Ethan said, sitting beside him. "How are you feeling?" Leonard chuckled softly. "Old, but that's all right. I've had a good run." Ethan smiled, though a part of him felt uneasy. "You'll be fine. You just need some rest." Leonard nodded slowly. "Maybe, but before I go anywhere, there's something I want to give you." He reached for a small wooden box on the table and handed it to Ethan. Inside was a pocket watch, old but beautifully polished. "This was a gift from my first teacher," Leonard said. "He told me to give it to someone who reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. And now I'm giving it to you." Ethan held the watch carefully, speechless. "Thank you," he finally said. "I'll take care of it." Leonard smiled. "I know you will." They sat together for a long time, not saying much. Just two friends, two musicians, connected by something deeper than words. A few months later, Ethan released his first solo album. It was dedicated to Leonard, who had quietly retired from public life. The album was called Reflections, and its first track was simply titled For My Teacher. It became a huge success, but what mattered more to Ethan was the message behind it. In every interview, he spoke about Leonard, how a stranger's kindness had changed his life forever, and how one moment of courage at a hotel piano had led to everything that followed. One evening, Ethan received a letter in the mail. It was from Leonard. The handwriting was neat but slightly shaky. It read, "My dear boy, the world finally gets to hear what I always knew was inside you. You've made me proud beyond words. Keep playing, keep feeling, and keep reminding the world what real music sounds like. With admiration, always." Ethan read the letter several times, his heart full. He placed it in the same box with the pocket watch and kept it on his desk. Years passed and Ethan's name became known in the music world. He played in concert halls around the world, but he never forgot where it all began. Whenever he walked into a hotel lobby and saw a piano, he would smile and play a soft tune. Sometimes the silent waltz, sometimes something new. People would stop and listen, just like that first night. And maybe, somewhere, someone else would find their own spark of inspiration the same way he once had, because that was the true gift Leonard had given him. Not just music, but the reminder that beauty can appear in the simplest moments, in unexpected places when you least expect it. And so, the story that began with a man playing alone in a hotel lobby ended with another man carrying that same music forward into the world, proving that sometimes all it takes is one song, one chance meeting to change everything.